Hi everyone, welcome back to the Unpad Podcast, where psychology meets reality. Hi, I'm your host, Tiara Shafia from Batch 2021, and today we're going to talk about a little bit of a topic that I believe we've all have experienced before, and it's something really relatable. So today's topic is called phubbing. So it's a situation when someone ignores the people around them to focus on their smartphones, basically. So, of course, to help us understand the psychology behind this behavior and also deep dive a little bit on the consequences, I'm incredibly honored to welcome you, Dr. Monika McNeill. Dr. Monika is a psychologist and a lecturer at the Glasgow Caledonian University in the United Kingdom, whose research focuses on cross-cultural psychology, digital behavior, and mental health. She has been involved in global studies that explores the effect of smartphones, uses and misuses on our relationship, well-being, and even parenting. So I'm incredibly honored to welcome you, Dr. Monika McNeill. Hi, Dr. Monika. So how is everything going today?
Thank you very much for having me here, and I am also honored to be here, to be invited to this podcast in your FAPSI facilities. I've been here for a couple of days now. I'm staying for a week, and my colleague Dr. Gordon Hill and I visit you this week because we have a project, we have a grant from the British Council, and we work with your professors, your doctors on working closer and developing closer relationships, and yes, I really enjoy being here, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
We're really glad to hear that. Alright, so as I've mentioned that we're going to talk a little bit more about your specialties too here. I think before we get into our topic, probably if you don't mind sharing a little bit to our listeners about what made you interested in this topic, and probably a little bit background of the topic itself.
Of course. Phubbing is a very interesting area. It's quite a new area of exploration in psychology. And as you've already mentioned, phubbing is all about the kind of behavior that most of us probably can relate to, because it's linked with being around other people, being around friends and family, and being with people, but at the same time, while communicating with those people, taking our phone out and checking the phone and being distracted by the phone. And in general, we don't think that it's anything special, anything big. We just think it's a bit of a fleeting moment when we just engage with the phone and we go back to the conversation. But it turns out that the literature shows that it's kind of the opposite. It's different to what we would normally think, that it's so innocent and it doesn't really do much harm. It actually does. So once I found out with a group of my colleagues from other countries, we devised this project that we have run for a few years. We collected data in 25 different countries, including Indonesia, by the way. And we basically wanted to know how people use their mobile phones. Is it more serious than we thought it was? If it is, what happens when we use our phones? What happens to us? What happens to people who are around us? Does it have psychological consequences? It's pretty novel idea. So something like that really appealed to me, and I thought it is so applied. It really applies to all of us. Whenever I teach students about phubbing, I can see the lights in their eyes, showing that they actually can relate to it as well, and the conversations that we're having are quite vibrant as well. So people can relate to it, and I really like that fact in terms of research, that it's relatable, it's practical, and it says something about us psychologically.
Right, that's actually a really insightful answer, because I think it's true that the one thing that made me really engage on today's podcast is also because I think I would be able to relate much on this topic too. Okay, so I think without further ado, we could actually move into our first talk about I believe that as I've mentioned a little bit of an overview about what phubbing is, I believe the listeners here would also want to know more about what's actually phubbing. And from what I know, phubbing stands from two different words, so I think you could explain more about that.
Of course. Phubbing is a combination of two words,
Great.
and it comes from phone snubbing.
Okay.
So basically it describes a reality where we snub other people, kind of ignore them, and use our phone instead. That term was coined in 2012 in Australia and kind of took off, and the behavior was described by the term back then, and since then quite a lot of research has been carried out, and we know some really important things about our behavior and human nature and what it is and why we behave that way. So I think it was quite important to actually know what we're talking about, define it, and then we were able to test it.
Okay, right. So that's it. It's phone and snubbing. So I read a little bit an overview from your researchers too, and if I'm not mistaken, that there are two dimensions of phubbing. Probably you could elaborate and share more about what are those two dimensions.
The two dimensions of phubbing are communication disturbance and phone obsession. And we can describe communication disturbance as having both an internal and an external set of factors. For example, the internal set of factors would explain why we engage in this kind of activity. Because not everyone engages in phubbing to the same extent. Because we have our phones on us all the time, it's impossible not to completely check the phone while we're with other people, because we would have to isolate ourselves every time we try to check our phone, which is probably not very practical. But at the same time, some people are more prone to doing phubbing. And one aspect of it could be that people who do it more are those who are more easily distracted, or people who kind of don't do much at this very moment, that have an idle time or they're bored. So these are the examples of the internal factors. There are also external factors to communication disturbance. So as you can imagine, our phones call us a lot, right? So one of the ways they do it is by flashing or by vibrating, by ringing or pinging. So that type of phone activity contributes to the communication disturbance. So our own needs, but also what the phone does. And some people, as you probably know, or maybe do it yourself, keep their phone on silence most of the time. But there are other people who constantly ping and just use the phone and to create noise, so the phone really calls them all the time. So that's the communication disturbance. In terms of phone obsession, it's I'm sure the listeners have heard the term FOMO, right? So fear of missing out. People who use their mobile phone more to the point of really phubbing other people often also have quite high level of FOMO, so fear of missing out. So they kind of obsessively engage with their phone because they constantly want to know what's going on. Of course, that's linked to different psychological needs, and we can discuss it much further, but at the moment we're discussing the term of phubbing, so I think these are the most important aspects of it.
Okay. That is actually a really interesting answer, because I'm actually pretty curious. I mean, if from what you explained, I could actually think that phubbing is more on a negative side. But then I'm pretty curious, why do people, usually when we do phubbing, we don't really realize that we're actually doing it. So I'm pretty curious, is there like an explanation on why do we actually usually do phubbing unconsciously?
When we think about phubbing, I think people who have noticed that they have been treated that way would probably say, oh, because the person who does it behaves in a rude way. They're rude. They do it because they're not well behaved or something like that. But in fact, when we started testing phubbing, when we started exploring it from the research point of view, we've noticed that phubbing is actually a really habitual behavior. Often we don't even think about it, we don't realize it, we don't really know, we don't have any idea how important the consequences might be. And I think probably most people who haven't heard about phubbing would agree with that. It's just a little thing that we do, it's not important. I'm just checking my phone, how important can it be? So it's a habitual type of behavior. It's a little bit, we can compare it to scratching an itch. You know, there is a phone vibrating somewhere in your pocket. So it's a little bit like having an itch and scratching it, phone vibrating, you don't even remember checking it. We don't remember checking it because it's so habitual and we're so used to it. And more people, some people more than other people, basically just ignore the fact that it's not something that perhaps adds to communication with people around us. It's quite the opposite.
Right, okay. Yeah, I think that really answers my question, because it becomes really habitual to the point that we don't really realize that we're actually doing phubbing. Okay, now that I think we understand together what phubbing is in general, I would like to talk a little bit more from the psychological side. So my first question that I'm actually really curious is, from the studies you've been doing, how does phubbing actually impact the mental health? And is there like certain emotional or cognitive consequences that comes along with the phubbing behavior?
In short, there are some serious consequences, both emotional and cognitive. We know that phubbing contributes to differences in attention span. And we also know that, for example, phubbing correlates quite highly with low mood and depression. And talking about studies that we have done and our colleagues have done as well on phubbing, we know, for example, that phubbing correlates quite highly with loneliness. If you think about basic psychological needs, or if you think about a hierarchy of needs by Maslow, right? We have a need for physical aspects of our beings, a need for the air and for water, food, but also the needs go higher and higher and higher. And one of the needs is belonging and being accepted and not being rejected, being a part of a group, a part of social circle. And it turns out that when we are exposed to phubbing, so for example, someone who phubs us behaves that way, we will feel more lonely and socially rejected because of we're treated that way. And we only know it through research, because if we think about it, if we didn't have any research on that, we would probably think that the consequences are not as serious, but they really are. We also know that phubbing correlates quite highly with depression, low mood and depression. So people who, interestingly, and I think this is very interesting, because we can imagine that those who are being phubbed can experience those consequences, but actually people who phub have the consequences too.
Oh, okay.
Because, you know, if we use our phone and disrupt the communication between us, you're going to feel the consequences, but I will also.
Right.
So for example, for me, I'm not going to feel that our communication is as meaningful. I'm not going to feel that we have a connection. I'm not going to feel that I can actually relate to you at the same way, at the same level that I could if I didn't have this constant disruption. So initially we were thinking that people who are being phubbed have more serious consequences, which they do, but people who actually do the phubbing have quite serious consequences as well. And we know as well that attention gets really affected in those people who behave in a phubbing way. We also know that the research shows us that it affects self-esteem.
Oh, okay.
And it really affects self-esteem, especially in young people, teenagers, because their identity is being formed, is being created. They learn about who they are. And when they're being phubbed, because that's accepted in their friend circle or at home, because of that, we've noticed that in studies that those people really are affected and their self-esteem is not as great, not as high as it could have been without being exposed to phubbing. So there are quite a lot of different psychological consequences, and a lot of them are quite serious.
Right, okay, that is actually a very interesting point, because it's true. I mean, seeing it on a common sense way, then probably the people being phubbed will be even more impacted. But then it works both ways. I think that's a very interesting one. But then talking more about it, as you mentioned, it's also highly correlated with loneliness, depression, anxiety. I'm actually pretty much curious about whether that phubbing is more like a symptom to those mental health issues, or it's actually one of the causes that cause those mental health issues.
Yes. So it's a little bit like, is it a chicken or an egg?
Yeah, right.
Exactly. A lot of studies on phubbing use correlational designs. And we know that correlation designs don't really necessarily show the cause and the effect. They, however, they show and they can explain to some extent how different variables are correlated, how they coexist together.
Yeah.
So this is one kind of aspect of these studies. So because of that, we can probably be more sure that something coexists together rather than one causes the other. But these days, because of more advanced analysis, we also know that, and we can say that it's both ways. So for example, if we already experience low mood or anxiety, phubbing could be a consequence of that particular condition, that particular situation, and we might use it as a distraction, as a means to feel better. It means to have connection if we don't have a connection because we're so anxious that we can't really form meaningful connections in real life. So it could go that way, but also the other way around, when we apply phubbing, because we just don't think about it, because we mindlessly check our phones, because we're used to it, because we habitually behave that way, that could also result in feeling in a particular way, feeling more disconnected, feeling more lonely, feeling less valuable, less important to people around us.
Okay, a very expected answer. In a way that I think the listener here also could already get a picture about what phubbing is and how impactful it is actually, even though we don't really realize actually how big the impact is. So talking more about your research that you've mentioned in the beginning, you mentioned about you've been doing researches all around different countries, which I'm actually pretty curious. So based on your findings, how universal is the psychological impact of phubbing? And in general, how is it different in different countries?
Mm-hmm. This is why we actually did the research, because we wanted to run the comparative psychological analysis in terms of different cultures. My colleague and good friend, Professor Błachnia from Poland, worked on developing this framework for our study, and we just joined the forces. And we collected data in so many different countries, as I've mentioned before, quite a few of them. So in total, we collected data in 25 countries around the world, and that included a lot of countries in Europe, States, Canada, Mexico, countries, Brazil, countries in other countries in South America, countries in Asia as well, Japan, India. We also collected data in Indonesia.
Okay.
So we also have comparative studies from your country, and what we found was that phubbing affects everyone.
Okay.
It's universal.
Great.
That's what we wanted to find out.
Great.
Therefore, the tests, the scales to explore phubbing have been translated into different languages. We did quite a lot of work translating and back translating, so we collected all of that data, and then we produced quite a few different papers, and sometimes the paper might be based on findings from particular, 17 countries or 22, 21 countries or 20 countries, depending on what aspect of the study we were talking about in a particular paper. And the question you asked, so it's a universal phenomenon, unfortunately, I would say, but it also shows that we're all humans.
Right.
We behave this particular way, and it's probably a good idea to realize that.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to different cultures, we have also, apart from the similarities and the fact that phubbing applies to all the cultures, we have seen some differences as well. And one of the differences applies to the fact whether a particular culture is more individualistic or more collective.
Oh, okay. Very interesting.
That's right. What we've noticed was that phubbing applied, so the consequences of phubbing applied in both. However, people understood it slightly differently.
Okay.
So, for example, in more individualistic cultures like the UK or the States, people were actually quite proud that they could multitask.
Okay.
Because they could have a conversation, but also they could check their phone. So phubbing was accepted more by those who were doing it and by those who were experiencing the consequences of it. They still experienced the consequences. They still felt worse, felt less valued, felt more disconnected. They were convincing themselves that it's okay.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
And on the other hand, in terms of more collective cultures, like for example your culture, phubbing was seen more as a disruption in a relational fabric. So for example, it was seen as something less acceptable. And because of that, it seemed to be, we've seen that when we asked people how they experienced it and asked them how they felt afterwards, they experienced it more. So if you have more collectivistic cultures where connection, relationship, making sure that we're together, if we are together, we want to really be together. If that is a value, then phubbing affects us more. We've also noticed something interesting that we saw across the cultures as well. And it didn't matter whether it was more collectivistic or individualistic culture. We've noticed that females were more affected by phubbing when they were being phubbed.
Okay, that's an interesting point.
That's right. And one of the explanations that we proposed was that we believed that females, in general, there are quite a few different studies showing that females, it doesn't really matter at what age, but young women specifically are really affected by what they see on social media, what they see online.
Okay.
So because of that, they're more affected by it in terms of comparison, in terms of the effects, in terms of mood, in terms of anxiety, and also in terms of behaviors like self-harming. So females tend to be more affected. In this particular context of phubbing, we've proposed that when we talk about females, they're more focused on the relational aspect of communication rather than males. And because of that, they were more affected by phubbing.
Okay, that is an additional insightful point, because I think, again, I never thought that phubbing would actually have a really big impact to everyone. Okay, so to conclude a little bit, so from what I understand that basically in general it actually affects universally everyone. There's actually a negative impact from that. However, it might differ based on their cultural contexts too. Right, okay, so I think it's pretty clear on that topic, but I'm actually curious with another research focus. If I'm not mistaken, that I think you were also researching a lot on parental phubbing, which I'm not really sure. I think that's a very new term for me, and I think that's also a new term for the listeners. So could you help us, probably walk us through about that topic?
You know, when we were talking about phubbing being something universal, primarily it applies to different cultures, but it also applies to different ages.
Okay.
So children, phub, young adults, phub, teenagers, adults, older people. And it's no surprise that parents who have children also do it, right? So parental phubbing is what we describe, the way we describe the behavior performed by parents when they use their phone while engaging with their child. Because phubbing also just need to be, it's not every time we check our phone we phub someone. It's only when we are in a relational kind of exchange, in a communication situation with someone. So when parents, let's say, play with children or look after them, or the child comes and wants to have a conversation, and instead when the parent uses their phone, or a child wants to have a communication, but because the parent uses the phone, they won't approach the parent, that is what we look at as parental phubbing.
All right. Okay. I actually get the picture now. However, I think I scrolled a little bit on the research too, and I think if I'm not mistaken, there was it would differentiate into paternal and also maternal phubbing. What I'm curious is there any differences on that two types of phubbing to the child's development?
This is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really neat.
I know, we were quite surprised when we saw differences in other colleagues, other researchers' findings as well, when we actually found out that it matters if a mom or a dad engage with their phone while looking after their children. It does matter. So what we've noticed was that when mothers use their phones, typically children would play out. So for example, they would throw a tantrum, or they would constantly keep talking and wanting to get attention from their mom. So they externalize their behavior more, wanting to get that attention that they're deprived of. Because when we talk about phubbing being disruption in communication is one of our basic needs. Mm-hmm. So a child has a need to engage, and their parent is the biggest part of their world.
Right.
Their world is who is with them at that point. And if that world is preoccupied with something else, then a child loses their bearings and they don't know what to do. They really want to get that attention. So it works more with their mum.
Oh.
What we've also noticed that it's not obviously 100% of findings, but typically on average, when fathers phubbed their children, the children tended not to externalize, but they tended to internalize and withdraw.
Okay.
So the different kind of behavior is something that we observed in context of different parents.
Right, okay, that's actually very interesting. What I'm curious then is there a research or an answer of why they might show different behaviors when it comes from their mothers or when it comes from their father?
Yes. One of the explanations is research on attachment. So typically it's the mum that is the first adult that a child forms an attachment with. And of course, it's in an ideal world, we would talk about secure attachment when a child feels looked after, a child needs something, mum looks after the child, and then the child starts exploring the area, the surroundings, and they can do it, and they go back for reassurance, and so on. So it's more relational with a mum. So wanting that attention, struggling for that attention is basically a problem-solving kind of behavior. When it comes to fathers, the reason in the literature that you can find, the reason that the researchers give as to why children withdraw more is that the role of a dad, of a father, typically is slightly different to the role of a mum. So mum usually probably spends more time with the child, and once again, I know it's not always the case, and I don't want to say it's always happens that way. No, it doesn't. But we're talking about in general, on average. So when a child spends time with their dad, it's the role of that time is different, and the aim of the time is different. It's more about setting kind of ideals for different behaviors and teaching different behaviors, and rather than relational, it's more about expanding the world and learning new things. So if I can't learn as a child, if I can't have your attention and I can't ask you to teach me new things, I'm just going to go away. I'm just going to withdraw. And that's one of the examples, one of the explanations as to why.
Okay, that's a very understandable answer. So I've read another research that basically mentioned about it links parental phone use to feeding behavior and also language development in children. So can you share with us a little bit more about that findings?
Of course. And there is a very interesting study that shows that when mums were asked to take part in a study with their babies, with their children, they're kind of toddlers, between 1.5 and 2 years of age. Half of them were asked to all of them were asked to teach children a new word. It was a nonsensical word. It was something that, because they needed to know that the child didn't know that word before. So they were asked to teach children 2 or 3 different words like that. They were short words, not difficult to learn by a young child. Half of the mums who took part in the study were asked to basically just do it with their child. Another half were asked to do it, but at the same time they had to take a phone call, or they had to check their phone. And what we found was that those children whose mum had to take a phone or engage with their phone did not learn the words.
Oh, okay, that is very interesting.
They just withdrew, they would go distracted, they were not interested. Because you have to remember that children's attention span in that age is quite short.
Yeah.
So if they didn't get it, that was it. So that was quite interesting. And there's another study that tells us that feeding behavior is quite different in babies. So for example, when a mom feeds a baby, it was found that the babies whose mums, and we're talking babies, the babies don't understand what the mum is doing, and they're basically just eating food, they're just being fed by the mum, breastfeeding them. So the babies who were breastfed by their mum, who was checking the phone, who was on the phone at the same time, ate more.
Okay.
Because so what we think is that the baby doesn't have this natural moment when they stop, because they're already full and satisfied. They're still craving attention, connection. They probably overcompensate for the lack of connection by they want to be around their mom for longer, so they keep eating. And we don't know yet because it's too early to know, but is that going to have consequences in terms of obesity later on, in terms of difficult weight management? We don't know, but it could be the case. There's also another very interesting study that quite a few of those studies have been done on at playgrounds. So of course there were observational studies and questionnaire types of studies, but playgrounds as well. So the observational studies in playgrounds showed that if a parent was at the playground with their child, they were paying attention, encouraging their child, the child would just play and be happy and just do things and explore. But if they don't, if the parent uses their phone, they stay on their phone rather than engaging with the child. First thing is that children become irritable and they play out, and they want attention. That's one consequence. Another consequence, which is quite interesting, I found it very interesting, when they run or they climb, they fall down more often.
Okay.
And is it because they want to attract attention? Maybe.
Yeah, true. Okay, right. I think it was a very insightful one because, I mean, I wouldn't imagine that this is something we do really commonly, phubbing, using our phones a lot of times, but I never imagined that it could have that much impact. Even babies could actually feel the impact of the overuse of the smartphones.
That's right. These studies are quite new. And we see more and more projects within that area, and I think those projects and those studies are super important.
Right, I think I would be interested to keep on searching more on this.
Exactly.
Right, so because so far we have been talking a lot of the negative impacts, all the problems that is caused by phubbing, I think it would also be nice if we could actually talk about solutions. What are solutions that can be offered? Because I think this is something we have been really close with. We're really related to it. We might be the one who's also doing the phubbing. So I think having some alternative solutions on this would be nice.
I think it's probably a good idea to think about phubbing as something we do when we don't pay attention.
Right.
So we do it mindlessly. Therefore, if we talk about solutions, what is the opposite to mindless living?
Mindful living.
That's right, isn't it? So it's a little bit like, let's imagine a situation when people behave in a mindless way. We're humans. So in many situations, we can probably relate to some aspects of this. Oh, I'm just doing something automatically, mindlessly. And for example, if we think about, let's say, our well-being. So our well-being has, of course, many aspects, and we can discuss it and define it in different ways. But mindful living will positively impact our well-being. And for example, if we make a comparison with the digital life or area of functioning and perhaps something else that we do quite automatically, which is nutrition, which is food, which is eating. So for example, if we think about digital diet and digital nutrition, it probably is going to be something that we can all relate to. So what can we think about when we say dieting? What's dieting? It's probably limiting something, making sure that we don't overdo it, we don't overeat. Dieting is also being aware of what works for us, what doesn't work for us, or maybe let's just not eat that many carbs if they don't agree with us, right?
Right.
So if we talk about digital dieting, what can we do? Maybe when I talk to you, if I want to really relate to you, I'm just going to put my phone away for those 15 or 20 minutes or half an hour.
Right.
The world's probably not going to collapse in that time.
Oh, true.
Right?
Right.
What other things we can do is, let's say, I am an academic lecturer and I started asking students to actually put their phones away from their sight, away from their reach, in terms of not really having them on their table, on their desk, because the phones really distract us, even if they are there. I remember one of my students had the phone in the past, before I asked them to do it, to put their phones away. One of the students had the phone, and over the course of 2 hours, she was constantly pressing the button so that the phone needed to light up. She needed to see that what's going on there. She had that strong FOMO probably as well, that she needs to do that. I can see it in many people, they just need to press and check. So if we're talking about digital dieting, well, let's just have some mindful ideas about how to have a healthier digital life. Perhaps if we sit around a table, if we have dinner, do we need our phones with us?
Not so.
Probably don't, right?
Right.
And if we have meaningful conversations, or if we do a piece of work, do we need it? We're probably going to have less attention spent to the task. So we're going to spend more time eventually doing the task. So when we talk about digital, Young is one of the researchers of Phubbing, and she suggested digital diet, but also we can talk about digital nutrition.
Okay, what's that?
Right, so the diet is being aware of what serves us, being aware of how much to do it, and how maybe make sure that we don't do it all the time. We don't snack on the phone all the time, right? We can relate to that. But digital nutrition refers to what's healthy, what is healthy. Maybe rather than doom scrolling on social media all the time and comparing ourselves to other people, well, maybe just limit that to a couple of bursts, one in the morning, one in the evening. We can decide, the person can decide themselves what serves us. Perhaps maybe doing something creative on the phone. Rather than doing it while we are with other people, let's just not phub other people. Let's just do it when we're on our own. So do something creative, do something that develops us, do something that makes us feel happier, do something that maybe makes us feel more interesting, so that then we can share it with our friends. So dieting is how much, and the nutrition is basically what serves us, what works better, what increases our well-being rather than peace.
Okay, so I think to conclude that, basically it's mindfulness. The more we're actually mindful of what we're doing, of what we have actually full control on what we're going to do, and I think that's one way to actually help us stop with this phubbing behavior. Okay, so I think today's talk was pretty much very engaging. I mean, this is something that I believe all our listeners would also relate much, and I think I've never thought about it that it's actually this negative, this impactful, because I think it's something we commonly do, and I think it's something I also do, but then today's talk actually opened my eyes that this is something I actually also need to work on myself when we're talking.
And so do I.
Yeah.
I think it will probably, if people are honest and we ask them about phubbing, probably everyone will just have something to say about it, and maybe just to say, I'm just going to have a bit of a mindful approach to it and see how it goes if I don't use it in other people's face when I communicate with them.
Right, I think even from today's talk, without having my phone around, I think today's talk is really much engaging, and I think this 10 to 20 minutes of talk it doesn't really feel that long.
Right.
Okay, so I think before we really end our talk today, our discussion today, I would like to, if you could actually leave a small message to our listeners, to the young people here, about especially students who are living in a digital generation. I think it's also common for you as a lecturer to see us taking notes too. A lot of our like on our daily tasks, we do everything on our phones. And is there any message that you can give to us that would probably might help us also to do that digital diet?
I think I don't want to create an impression that I'm against technology or against the phones, because I honestly can see the benefit. I use my phone, I use it for a lot of tasks, a lot of things. And I think realistically, this is where we are, and there are massive benefits from being able to live in these times when we can connect. You know, us coming here to Unpad and being able to sit here with you and having this conversation, we did a lot of communication. The majority of our communication with your professors was via digital means. We have meetings every 2 weeks with your professors. Of course, they're online.
Great.
So I have a lot of respect for the fact that we are able to do it. And the phones, we can go around, they help us connect, they help us be around other people as well. So I am really in favor of technology, of digital technology. What my message, I would say, the main message would be, is that our phone are brilliant. They help us connect, but they also make us disconnect.
Right.
So let's be mindful of it, and let's basically be those who decide what we want. So do we want them to help us connect? Because they do it already, and let's just benefit from it. But they also, in terms of phubbing, they make us disconnect. Do we want it in our lives? Right? So if I don't want that to happen, maybe just think about how we can not make other people feel ignored. Let's just not use it in front of other people. If we have to, maybe in that moment say, listen, I'm really sorry, I have to check because this call may be important. Take a phone, put it away. Right? And that also shows respect for the other person. It doesn't show that we ignore them. They feel respected and important. And we also are not going to struggle with our attention, that we can then, obviously, we can see a lot of attention issues in young people, and that is also related to that. So let's remember that the phone is something that can help us connect, but also can make us disconnect, and it's our choice what we want.
Right, okay. I think that last bit about phones can connect but also disconnect would be something I would put on my mind, to be more mindful actually of using my phones, especially during interactions with other people. So thank you so much, Dr. Monika, for joining us today. And I think many of us would also gain a lot of information, insights, and I think what's most importantly is we reflect back to ourselves, because this is something that I believe everyone has been doing, and probably some of us also might have already experienced that. It's not actually a really enjoyable experience when we get phubbed by other people. So, to all our listeners today, thank you for tuning in. If today's episodes make you think that you also need a digital diet, please share with us about your experience on our comment section down below. So don't forget to connect with us in Unpad's YouTube channel and also in our social media platforms. I'm Kiara and I'm your host today, and see you in our next episode. Thank you so much.